Hello, I'm Susan Nolan from Seton University, and I'm really excited to be here at the ICP virtual conference. Thank you to my colleague Andrew Simon for that really nice introduction. I would also like to offer thanks to Dr. Machiko Fukuhara, the founder of the Fukuhara Award, which is the talk that I'm giving today, as well as Dr. Mary Beth Kenkel, the award chair, the Fukuhara Award chair, Dr. Naoki Asazuma, and all of my ICP colleagues. I'm excited to talk to you today about the urgency of internationalizing our psychology courses and curricula. Psychology is increasingly popular everywhere in the world. It's growing even in regions that had very little psychology education relatively recently. One statistic that really stands out to me is the fact that in the 1980s, 80% of the world's psychologists were in the United States. More recently, that number is 21 to 24%. And that is not because the number is shrinking in the US, actually, it's growing. It's because it's just growing like mad around the world, which is wonderful for those of us who love the field and see the impact that it can have on our societies. So it's getting more popular, and it's also increasingly internationalizing, and elements related to that are increasingly seen as important parts of the discipline. So my colleague Eric Landrum talks about his 5 themes, things that we can use to convince students of the relevance of psychology. And this includes thinking like a psychologist, improving your work life, being healthy, understanding families, groups, and cultures, and maintaining healthy relationships. And all of these can be internationalized, of course. But particularly understanding families, groups, and cultures, I think, relies on having an international backdrop to our courses and to the major. Similarly, the American Psychological Association's 5 guidelines for the undergraduate psychology major, which came out in 2013, they are being revised right now. There's going to be an APA Guidelines 3.0, and I'm actually on that committee, which has been really exciting to see an increasing emphasis on an international context. But of these 5, one of them is ethical and social responsibility in a diverse world. All of these can be internationalized, again, of course, but the ethical and social responsibility in a diverse world, I believe, requires an international emphasis in all of our teaching. So I'm going to talk about a few different things, and one is what we can learn from in the US from international models. And here I just want to acknowledge that I am talking from a US viewpoint. I hope that there will be some takeaways that you can use no matter where in the world you're from, and I would be eager to have a conversation about this with all of you, on things that are very much specific to the US, things that could work broadly around the world, and things that you might use in your own country or culture that might not work in the United States. I think most interesting and exciting model that's out there is in Europe, the Bologna process, which is in almost all European countries, all except Belarus. And the Bologna process, we would often talk about this as sort of a standardization, but that's not a word the Bologna process uses. They talk of it in musical terms, not harmonization. So each country's curricula can be specific to that context, and yet they are harmonized in the sense that they work together. So there are lots of good things about it, which I'll talk about in a second. There's also a layering on top of that of some discipline-specific harmonizations. And within psychology, that discipline-specific harmonization is called Eurosci. And I'm sure many of you, especially those of you in Europe, already know about this. But I find that when I talk about this framework to many of my US colleagues, they have not heard of it or don't know much about it. I had the fortune of being able to spend my last sabbatical in 2015-2016 on a US Fulbright scholarship in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I studied their implementation of the Bologna process in Eurosci. And to me, Bosnia and Herzegovina was particularly interesting because since the war, they have been rebuilding a lot of their educational systems, creating new programs, and working to fit within Bologna process and Eurosci, in some ways formally, in some ways informally. And I saw it as a really interesting model for anyone in the US doing something like this, because we would really be starting from scratch in terms of our harmonization. So I apologize if I get any of this wrong, but I did spend my time in Bosnia and Herzegovina trying to really understand the Bologna process in Eurosci. A list of all of the countries. So the Bologna process includes this bulleted list of features. And some of them are things that we use in the US already. So for example, we already have 3 levels. We do a 4-year undergrad plus some kind of a master's on the way to a doctorate, or sometimes separate, and then the doctorate. In Europe, it's 3 years undergraduate, 2 masters plus a doctorate. And of course, the terminal degree for a practicing psychologist in Europe and in many other countries around the world is a master's degree, which is actually something I think the US could learn from as well, given that there's a good deal of research that shows that outcomes for psychotherapy patients are similar for when their practitioners have a doctorate versus a master's. The second thing that's similar in the United States is this idea of this European credit transfer system, ECTS, where you get points. And we do credit hours in the United States. So there are a lot of similarities there. Also, in many countries in Europe, there used to be 1-year courses, 2-year courses. Sometimes there's just one oral exam at the end. And so the Bologna process now has 1 semester courses, which is typical in the United States. There also is an encouragement of active and applied learning. And active learning has been something that has been embraced in the US for a long time. Not as many lecture-based courses, and that's also part of Bologna. And then finally, the last of the main features of Bologna that we already see in the US is frequent assessments. So not this one big exam at the end of the semester, but quizzes and other kinds of assignments and multiple tests or papers or short papers, all this kind of multiple assessments during the course. But there are a lot of features that are also quite different from the United States system. And these include, I think most importantly, this European higher education area. So this is where we've got this harmonization, and it promotes mobility. So if I take a course at another institution, I can bring that back to my home institution without a problem. Now, in reality, there are some hiccups there. There are sometimes barriers, and it doesn't work as smoothly as you might think. But in the United States, it's a lot trickier to do that, and you have to get all kinds of approvals in advance. If a student, for example, goes to study in another country in the US, we have to have every single course approved before they go by the department, by the dean, and it makes it much more difficult to do that. Mobility also refers to taking your degree and working in another country. And we all know that, especially if you're a practicing psychologist in the United States, those of you who know our system, know that it's at the state level. So I'm not licensed. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but never got licensed because I fell into the world of teaching and research. But let's say I had been licensed in my home state of New Jersey, and then I wanted to practice in New York, where I live in Jersey City. I can literally from my bedroom see the World Trade Center across the way. I'm that close. And yet I would have to undergo all of the licensure procedures for New York as well. There's a little bit of reciprocal agreements in some places, but it's not easy in a lot of cases. So the higher education area, which provides this mobility, I think is a really important model for the US and other world regions. This is another one, the idea that outcomes are connected to the market, that there are stakeholders other than just the people that are our immediate constituents, our students, maybe our alumni, the faculty members, the people who are on our campus. And that's something I think that the US can learn a lot from. And finally, outcomes that are, again, market-driven, the assessments of a program or of a student at the end of their degree are tied to those. So students are more likely to be job ready. Now, again, none of this works as perfectly as it's described here, but we're not even trying to do this at most places in the United States. We do have some tuning projects, as they're called, in keeping with this musical language, which looks across faculty members, students, yes, and employers in consultation with businesses, with government, etc., to see what a degree and a field stands for in terms of a student's learning and their competencies, their skills. What can they do when they graduate? And there are some programs like the LEAP Values program who are doing work in this area. That's very exciting, but it's not widely adopted. And the accrediting bodies, which are regional in the United States, so they're not even standardized across the country, are not looking at this to the degree, not even close to the degree that they are through Bologna. So in Bologna, the stakeholders are not just the faculty members and the students, which we also look to in the United States, but employers, business leaders, government leaders, and the public. So importantly, people who study Bologna and write about it say, don't just take it. Obviously, there are differences among different places in the world. It would be really nice if the whole world could just be harmonized, but it's not going to happen. But even though we can't just take it in, whole cloth, it's, as Elizabeth Colucci here says, it's a European solution to European needs. We can look at the model and the way that it was created as a framework that other places might adopt. And in fact, many places are working on projects. So we have tuning projects, often in collaboration with the European Union, going on in all of the places that are in color in this map. So there's a tuning Africa, there's a tuning project in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. There's also some initial projects going on in Canada. You see some work going on, and also in Australia, which has adopted a qualifications framework a number of years back that is in part inspired by Bologna. But you'll notice that there are really not a lot of parts of the world. Obviously, Europe is in gray here because they have the Bologna process. So these are ones that have taken it and done something with it. But the United States and Russia are the two sort of really big places that are not explicitly doing work related to some kind of a regional higher education area. So, I don't think that we have nothing to offer. I think there are some really amazing parts of the U.S. higher education system. It is considered to be one of the best in the world. But when we look at the psychology undergraduate level, I think one of the things that I love about it, and I know there are some who would argue against both of these, but these are things that I love about it, are the breadth that you are exposed to in terms of the field of psychology. So in the European higher education area, a psychology undergrad during those 3-year degrees is actually doing primarily courses that lead toward becoming a practitioner. That is an assumption, and that assumption is you're going to do that 2-year master's afterwards. So there isn't the same breadth of choices of classes that are not clinical or counseling related that you see in a U.S. psychology degree. You could go through my program at Seton Hall University where I teach, taking barely any classes related to clinical and counseling if that was what you desired to do. We also have a strong emphasis on a liberal arts education, on gen ed, which is not as prominent in many places in Europe. Again, there's some who would argue, what they're doing through the European higher education area is much more practical and better, and we could absolutely have a debate about it. But I do think that these are really important parts of it, particularly because only about a quarter of graduates from undergrad institutions in many countries, including the US, including Australia, including in some European countries, go on to professional higher education. So I think we need to focus on those who are taking their psych degree and applying it sort of broadly. Actually, just this morning I was listening to the Psych Sessions podcast, and Dr. Marianne Lloyd, my Seton Hall colleague, has a a podcast that's part of it called Ask Psych Sessions, and she had an IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist, Dr. Derek Avery on, and he said that basically every single field except psychology is applied psychology, and he made a really compelling case that, if you go into marketing, you're doing applied psychology. If you go into sales, you're doing applied psychology. If you go into a whole wide range of fields, you're really doing applied psychology. So let's speak to that constituency as well. On the other hand, what can we learn in the US from Bologna and other places in the world that might be interested in a system like this? We can think about where our students end up. I don't think pay nearly as much attention to where they end up and what skills and competencies they need to succeed in that workplace. What then do they need to get there? What should we be teaching? Again, not just knowledge, but skills and competencies. And then what do they need to succeed? So even if we're doing some kind of an alumni survey, like we do at my institution, we are asking them where they are, and we're asking them what they thought of their degree, but we're not really trying to find out what skills and competencies they feel that they need and what their employers say that they need. In the longer term, I think we need to think about mobility issues. And so far, I've just talked about within the United States, across states. So for example, the Master's in Experimental Psychology at Seton Hall requires that students take certain courses. So for example, a separate statistics and research methods course. So sometimes we have a student who applies and we accept them contingent on them taking a class they haven't already taken. I mean, that's not good mobility. I can't just assume a psychology undergraduate degree has prepared students for our program in the ways that we expect. And we also need to think about mobility internationally. It's pretty tricky, as anyone who's tried to take your degree and work in a different country, unless, again, you're within that European higher education, you have your Eurosci diploma. It's very tricky to move from country to country, especially as a practicing psychologist. And I think it's also important to start strengthening connections across borders. And that's where a lot of wonderful organizations like ICP come in to create these networks that I think are so key. We also can learn more about accountability. So this idea of qualifications frameworks. What is it that students know how to do? What are their competencies? We also can rethink credits. So students earn credits for completing a course with a certain grade. But does that grade indicate that they know how to do something? Is it tied to something very specific that students can then market? And also this idea of degree supplements. So you get your degree, but you also get this sort of certificate or diploma or supplement or whatever you want to call it that highlights what it is exactly that you can do based on that degree and any assessments that have demonstrated for an individual student that they can do that. So Clifford Edelman, who died a couple of years ago, did really wonderful work writing about Bologna for US audiences, and he tried to sell us on the idea of degree supplements and qualifications frameworks. He said it's a warranty of everything that's happened before it, and it's really student-centered. And I think just most importantly, we absolutely need to involve more stakeholders. Unlike other places in the world, Australia is doing a really good job with this. My colleague, Dr. Jackie Cranny, has written about some of this, this idea of bringing employers to campus, having them be involved in a capstone project where students are doing something real world. So getting that connection in a very direct way between the university and the stakeholders, the employers, again, the public, government, business leaders, and so on. There also are a couple of frameworks that I think could work internationally in terms of a kind of way of harmonizing and not making it too specific. And I totally credit Dr. Jackie Cranny for turning me on to these ideas. She's done really good work in both of these areas, and I'm starting to do some projects with her, which is really exciting. One is the concept of psychological literacy. So you can see from this definition the ethical application of psychological skills and knowledge in ways that benefit individuals in personal, occupational, and civic lives, and subsequently benefit society as a whole. This is something that could be adapted to really any international or cultural context. And related to psychological literacy is this idea of global citizenship. Global citizenship education is, I think so psychological literacy is specific to our field, whereas global citizenship education is broader than just our field, but I think that they can connect. So it's the idea of an understanding of global interrelatedness and the capacity to live, work, and contribute positively as a member of global communities. So I think psychology is uniquely situated to do both of these things because we have psychological science that undergirds how to build relationships, how to build community, how to apply science to policy, and so on. So more generally, and there's several great papers about this, including Stevens and Wedding's paper from a few years back that talk about what the US can learn from international psychology. So study abroad, we don't do nearly enough of it. We make it hard, as I said earlier, and requiring that students learn multiple languages, and not just the undergraduate level, but the doctoral level. We should be requiring students to become bilingual, not just to be able to go internationally, but even within our own country. We can learn about other fields like transportation psychology, political psychology, and so on. These other models of education, like I said earlier, the master's as a terminal degree to practice. How about national licensure? Wouldn't that be nice? An increased openness to indigenous cultures. Multidisciplinary collaborations. It's not something that we do a ton of the time. External validity versus internal validity. How much do our studies generalize? Well, one of the exciting advances in the field is this idea of a COG statement, a constraints on generality statement that some journals are starting to require. So you have to say to what degree your research generalizes beyond your sample. And then finally, a focus on social concerns and social policy. Just because we're doing science, which is very objective, doesn't mean we can't talk about how it applies to situations in which we might be an activist or a policymaker. I also think we really do need to teach students the context of the fact that so much of psychological science, what they're learning in their classes, particularly in places like the US, is not highly generalizable. So actually today in my international psychology class, I was talking about just this, the idea that psychology is weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, and that we can see from this graph that the less developed parts of the world are just growing in their population, whereas the more developed parts of the world are growing just very slightly and sort of leveling off. So as we continue to do research on those bottom gray parts of those bars, we're leaving out an increasingly larger percentage of the world. We also, this graph shows the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. It shows the major awards that they give and the percentage of them that they're giving to US scholars. So again, we're just not branching out in a lot of different ways. And I've showed these graphs to my students. We have discussions in class about this problem and what possible solutions might be. So Hershka, 2018 article talked about what we're missing out on if we're not doing research beyond our borders. So for example, Hershka gave a couple of examples. This is one of them. What shape would come next? And we would say, most of us from most cultures that are represented here, I think, would say an orange square. Children in Zambia, however, only 12.6% of them got it right. And yet that success rate tripled when the students were able to do it with 3D objects that were familiar to them. So it wasn't that they couldn't do it, it was a different cognitive context. We also know there's a lot of research, including some that I cited with my colleague Andrew Simon in a couple of chapters we wrote about the importance of including international and cultural examples in statistics and research methods classes. The famous Likert scale, most of which are actually not really even Likert, that's one of my pet peeves, Likert type scales, It turns out that people don't always answer them the same culturally. There are some places where people don't want to give, for example, the either end, because, for example, if it says never at one end, some cultures are like, well, it's not never. So you might get different patterns of responses. We've also seen, including one by Arnett, journal analyses that show these kinds of neglect. So we see an disparity in terms of who's writing papers, who's doing this research, who is being studied, the samples, and the gatekeepers, which include editors and editorial boards, but also granting agencies and other organizations that provide resources. So here we see the percentage of samples in several top journals that are majority white. And that's an older article, it's published in 2008, but Rad et al. In 2018 found similar results. We see here that not only are the samples not diverse, but they're not even necessarily reporting it. So this is all studies published in the journal Psychological Science a few years back, 2014. You can see that, yeah, gender is pretty well reported, but ethnicity and race, socioeconomic status, education, and compensation don't tend to be reported regularly. Why not? And here we see the national locations of samples, and you can see that 50.8% of samples in psychological science in that year were from the US. And the vast majority almost 90% were from English-speaking countries. And here you can see where 93% of studies published in psychological science in 2017 were from the countries in blue. We also have an issue where researchers, particularly in the US, we're actually, for those of us who are in the US, we're the worst. Canada is second worst in terms of identifying our samples as from the specific place that they're from. So an analysis of a bunch of paper titles, and this also plays out with abstracts as well. People in the US, Canada as well, but particularly the US, were just very likely to say what their study was about and not add that it was done in the US or a region of the US. Whereas people in many other countries would write in the title, say, in a study conducted in Colombia or in a study in Japan. This is actually from the most recent issue of Sex Roles, a journal of research, which is actually one of my favorite journals. I think it's actually one of the best in terms of having a very broad representation of international studies. But even in Sex Roles, which is one of the best, we still see these kinds of issues. So the top article here, you see that the authors indicate that it was done in Qatar. But the next one, Sexy, Thin, and White, etc., there's no indication of what country it was in. It's not described either in the abstract. You have to go all the way down to the participants section to learn that this is from introductory psychology courses at a large state university in the upper south of the United States. So there's this assumption, and I'm not knocking these authors at all. Like, I've done this plenty of times. You forget. Like, this is, I'm not blaming anyone who does this, but you sort of get acculturated to think, well, yeah, of course. And here are a few other articles from this recent, the most recent issue of Sex Roles, and you see that the all three mentioned. So I mentioned Brazilian version, U.S. local women of color, and Chinese adolescents. So we do have one that mentions the U.S., but it's sort of the exception that proves the rule, because here it's because it's being done in a marginalized group, in my opinion, U.S. local women of color activists, that it's being called out. So it becomes evident that this is not generalizing when it is a marginalized group or minoritized group, in a way that when you're just using, intro to psych classes, you don't think about it as much. It's something we need to think about. So I'd like to walk through my 9 tips for things we can do in the classroom, and again, from a US-centric perspective, I'd love to hear your ideas. I think some of these might work in different cultures and contexts. Certainly, that won't always be true. But these are the 9 things that I try to do in my own classes, and I try to think about them explicitly to make my classes just more sort of naturally built-in international. So throughout my courses, many of them, I use Veronica Bois-Monsilla's The 3 Whys, which are relevant to all. Actually, I cut 2 of my tips in the interest of not keeping you here all day. So that should say 9 tips, but there are more. So why might this topic question matter to me? So why would it matter to me? Why might it matter to people around me? So, my immediate community, my family, my friends, here on my campus, etc. And why might it matter to the world? Why might it matter on a global level? And I will bring these questions up. This is a slide just taken straight from my lecture notes, my PowerPoint slides for class. And I'll ask the students why. Let's walk through these. And the global one particularly pushes them sometimes. Well, why? Why is it? One of the things that's occurred, I think, during the pandemic is a realization of why what's going on in the world matters so much. Unfortunately, students are suddenly interested in research being done in other countries about variants, vaccines, spread. You hear people talking about, the latest data from Israel or the latest study from Japan. And so I think we're starting to realize why things might matter to the world. But these questions spur some really interesting discussion. So tip number 1, most textbooks, if you're using a textbook for your class, do have international examples. So pull them out. Make a point of when you're going through the chapter of saying, okay, yeah, like here's this example. So for example, when I teach abnormal psychology, I talk about the schizophrenia paradox. The fact that people with schizophrenia and other severe psychotic disorders often do better in less developed countries than in more developed countries. And why that might be true in terms of the ways in which people live in villages and communities and multi-generational families and so on. So pull those examples out and get your students thinking all the time about the fact that this is not just again, in my case, the US. You can also focus on international examples in the news. And in many of my classes, if not almost all of my classes that I teach, I pull in international examples at the beginning of every class that relate to that particular class. Actually, they're not always international, some are US, but I really try to get international examples. And here are a couple that I just shared very recently with my abnormal psychology class. This one I actually just shared the morning that I'm recording this talk. And this absolutely talks about around the world because we're seeing all kinds of disasters, including related to climate globally. And I call this feature in the news. I have that little in the news on all of the slides for this, and they're not required to know about these things on exams. It's just a little quick and easy. Like, here's another example. And this is one I shared with them about a week ago about racism in sports, which of course is not just in England, but I specifically try to pull the international examples to get them thinking outside of their own borders. I also really like the museum, today's front pages. What's really cool about it is that you can go and you can search. And actually, before I show you some of the front pages, they actually have all kinds of lesson plans and videos and interactive things, lots of tools that you can use in your classroom to think about the news. I do a lot on misinformation, including globally. Actually, I'll also make a shout out right now to First Draft News. And if you Google First Draft News, you can subscribe to their weekly newsletter with lots of ideas about global misinformation they focus on. But also, you can see from this map, they have front pages from newspapers around the world, and they're from today. They disappear after today, but it's a way where you can see for free what is on the front page, what is popular, what is being talked about in different countries. So you can see here just a selection from some countries in Asia, They're not all in English, but sometimes you don't even need it to be in English to see from the pictures what they're focusing on. And students find it really interesting to see how something that might be front page news in your own city or country is not even on the radar of another country, and vice versa. There are also lots of great resources from the United Nations. Just a couple, and I can share a handout with the links from today's talk, so if you're interested, I'll have a handout ready to go with all of these links. Also happy to share my slides. But UNESCO has a lot of great resources that are available for free to use in classrooms. And if you go to their resources and you click, you can see this nice click down here with all kinds of documents and publications, and down the bottom, different data sets and statistics, and just lots of stuff you can use. It's fun to dig around. And this is from their multimedia page, and that includes a photo bank, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. You can also use resources from psychology organizations, and I'll just mention 3, but there are tons of them. ICOPE, the International Council of Psychology Educators, has a really great website with tons and tons and tons of resources. So I highly recommend checking them out. I know there's been some overlap, I think, between ICP folks and ICOPE folks. So yeah, a really great organization. And also, I'm sure many of you know SPICY, the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues. I think there's also some overlap between SPICY people and ICP people, but there are some really great materials for teaching about social issues, many of which have international components. The American Psychological Association's Office of International Affairs has also really great educational resources for internationalizing psychology. Use your students' international experiences. I often will ask them to share their international experiences, and I will tell them that you have them even if you've never stepped foot outside the United States, as a number of my students have not. Here in New Jersey, where I live, it's extraordinarily international in terms of immigrant communities, and right here in Jersey City where I live, there's a little India, there's a little Manila, there are pockets of areas with tons of Egyptian restaurants, and if you go over to Newark, which is right practically next door, Newark, New Jersey, has a little Portugal with many people from Portugal and Brazil, and you can just walk the streets and eat at Brazilian and Portuguese restaurants and just hear Portuguese be spoken. So many parts of the world, I know not all, have the ability to have these international experiences without going all that far. So I will pull into what are your experiences being in even if it's just an area of a city that's not your culture, what are your experiences? How does it feel like when you're in that culture? How does it feel like when you go back to where you usually are? Are you seeing things with new eyes? So yeah, this is Little India and Jersey City. And even better when you have students, and I'm teaching international psychology right now, and over half my students have some kind of a direct route to another country, whether it's they are themselves or immigrants, or they're an international student, or their parents were immigrants. So that's really wonderful too, when they can bring that, particularly in international psychology, but you can do that really in any class. It's important to diversify names in your examples so your students from different backgrounds and from different countries can see themselves in your class. One of the easy ways to do that, this is a tool I use often, like when I'm writing an exam, or I will go to Wikipedia, the list of most popular given names, and then you can just scroll down through all kinds of regions and countries and get ideas. So here, just a sample from Algeria and Egypt. And once you get some diverse names, you can follow up with diverse photos. You might not have a name associated with it, but sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a name. So to give you an example, I take a name, Hamza, And I Google Hamza, and then I choose, you can see I've clicked Creative Commons license, so this is something that's free to use. And if you want to just mix up your examples, if you want a face on a slide, it doesn't have to be about a particular person, but just have someone who maybe diversifies how people look and how they dress and their hairstyles and clothing styles and race and ethnicity and so on. There's a ton of great websites out there right now with free photos. So unsplash.com has really gorgeous photos, lots of diversity in all kinds of different ways. I love this photo. It's so beautiful. They look so happy. And they're not wearing masks. Another one that I really like is pexels.com. Really gorgeous photos, really high quality, highly produced. And the contributors, their names are there, so you can give them credit in appropriate contexts. And again, I mentioned I'd come back to this, but UNESCO has in their media bank, they have photos as well. Require international examples in your assignments. I will just explicitly say to my students, no matter what the course, you've got to use at least whatever, depending what the assignment is. If there are going to be, you have to have, for a capstone seminar course, all right, you're going to be citing 12 peer-reviewed journal articles. At least 3 have to be not from the US. In my class, and actually both my abnormal psychology class and international psychology class, they're creating infographics as an assignment. And yes, have at least one international resource that you're using it. Well, in international psychology, it'll be more, but even in abnormal psychology, you can require that they have international examples in their assignments, which does 2 things. It makes them find them, but it also just reminds them that that might be not what they're automatically finding and that they need to look for these. And I also have op-ed and letter to the editor assignments. So in the citations, references, and examples, I will require that there be some international component. And when I give them examples, like, here's a really nice infographic that might give you some ideas, and this one's from the World Health Organization. So when I'm sharing examples as something to spur their imagination, I will pull international examples. And then finally, remind your students, in the US, that US examples or your own country's examples are international examples too. Sometimes my students are like, but that's the US, that's not international. Well, yes, it is. We're a country and the world. So I think that's really important. And the Slate series, if it happened there, is fabulous. They haven't updated it in a couple years, but here are, the last one was in 2018, but I'll let you read some of these. So basically what they do is they write about something in the United States as US reporters write about something that happens over there. So I'll just give you a quick example. This is the Super Bowl one, which is hilarious. The Super Bowl one is so funny. It's my favorite. So I'll just let you quickly read it. This is from a few years back. And the bottom, which is a little blocked by my video here, confusingly called football, except in a couple instances, feet do not touch the ball. The winner of the contest, I love this, will claim the title of world champion, although very few people play the sport beyond the country's national borders. This is so true. For those of you in the US who know US football, I think that hopefully you're particularly laughing. And I hope that those of you who are not from the US are laughing at this description of our national pastime. So this one for referring to players using a racial nickname too offensive to be printed in this newspaper, which of course was printed in US newspapers until just a couple years ago, where now it's finally called the Washington Football Team instead of the previous offensive name, which I will not say here. My students love those Slate if it happened here, because it really gets them thinking and sort of laughing about how they just accept naturally what happens in their own area, and then something, in another culture or country, they're like, that is so weird, that's so crazy. And in fact, lots of things we do here are really weird and really crazy, and it gets them thinking about the fact that, it's just interesting diversity everywhere. And finally, don't forget to focus on the good in the world too. I think it can be very easy when international crises are in the news to focus too much on the disasters. So this is a 2020 report from the United Nations. That's a nice place to come up with some good. So the Sustainable Development Goals, good practices, a compilation of success stories and lessons, and SDG implementation. And just one example from my classes, I talk about resilience. I use this example of a young undocumented LGBTQ activist who is an activist on behalf of LGBTQ people within the undocumented community, and talking about resilience, going through, and I'm just showing you these slides as examples, but 10 ways to build resilience, and we talk about this in the context of these young activists and how they are showing resilience in these different ways. And also, whenever I get a chance, I love to show the Happy Movie. The Happy Movie is global. The researchers are mostly, that they cite, the psychology researchers are mostly from the US, but it talks about happiness around the world, and it's really ultimately uplifting, and my students love it. At times, they've actually shown it in the psychology club or in other contexts when they didn't even have to, because they thought it was so fun. They've asked me, where can I find it to show my family? So if you get a chance and you want to talk about global happiness, I love the Happy Movie. Yeah. So thank you for inviting me here today to give the Fukuhara Award talk, and I just am grateful to be a part of ICP, and I'm excited for the rest of the conference. Thank you.